Welcome to Early Childhood Chapters, the podcast from Gryphon, where we connect with leading voices in early childhood education to explore the research, ideas, and practical strategies shaping the field. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Laura Bornfreund, a nationally respected education policy expert, former elementary teacher, and senior fellow focused on transforming kindergarten and strengthening the transition from pre-K into the early grades. Laura has written extensively on early childhood education for publications including The Atlantic, Education Week, and Slate. She is also the author of the new Gryphon book, Rediscovering Kindergarten, Embracing Play and Joy in Learning. Laura, thanks so much for joining us today. It's an honor to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, your book opens with your own daughter's kindergarten experience, and there's almost this feeling of heartbreak over what kindergarten has become in many places. So what is the moment when you realized something's wrong here?
Well, for years before, I had been visiting kindergarten classrooms and good examples of kindergarten classrooms. So I knew I wasn't entering the world of kindergarten without an understanding of what it could be and what it was in so many places. And so I think that moment where I really had that something's wrong here, something's not quite right, was at the parent meeting in the spring before kindergarten started, where they invited us to really get an idea of what kindergarten was all about. And, my daughter Ainsley had been attending pre-K just down the hall from where she would attend kindergarten the year before. And I loved the pre-K so much. It was, definitely play-based. There were two teachers. It was just a joyful experience for her. And at the parent meeting, immediately the vibe was kindergarten is nothing like pre-K. There, it's not play. There's no nap. And then there was this discussion of all the things that they ideally would know before they got there and a structured schedule of what, the day would look like, and really setting our expectations for something completely different.
You argue that kindergarten has drifted away from what young children actually need developmentally. So when did that shift begin, and what are the forces that pushed kindergarten towards this more academic, worksheet-driven model?
Over the years, really, kindergarten, kindergarten became a thing early on, there were some pendulum swings about what it should be. Like, should there be some of the early pioneers? Should there be some more academics? Should there be more structure? And then there was, pushback on, no, we want to hold to those early Froebelian ideas or what progressive education looked like. But where it really started this drift in the direction away from, being what children developmentally need was in the 90s, really, when we shifted as a country toward state academic standards. And then, the idea of, academic rigor became even more entrenched with No Child Left Behind. And that's when we had the introduction of more testing and accountability requirements that put significant pressure on schools to improve both positive and negative pressure. Academic standards are important. They set expectations for what all students will learn. We need assessments to ensure that students are mastering those expectations. And it was certainly important to shine a light, which No Child Left Behind did, on the students who are not getting enough attention. And, schools largely were not paying enough attention to some groups of students. But there's a significant difference that I think is worth pointing out between what pre-K early learning guidelines or standards look like and what K-12 standards look like in most states. Really, K-12 standards are limited to the academic areas that can be measured. Whereas when we're talking, these pre-K state expectations, they tend to take a much more holistic approach. They don't just include that high level look at what teachers should teach, but pre-K guidelines or early learning guidelines, as they're typically called, because they cover that birth to, up through pre-K time in children's lives. The standards look at the how. So they're really meant to guide teacher interactions and the environment rather than driving specific curriculum and assessment expectations like K-12 standards do. So this sets up a divide, and sets up that the fact that pre-K third alignment and that transition into kindergarten become more complex, even, especially for kiddos and families who participated in those preschool programs. So I think that this shift of toward academic standards and towards accountability and assessment really led to that more of a drift, and this idea of kindergarten becoming the new first grade, which a researcher from the University of Virginia actually studied specifically, looking at the early childhood longitudinal study, which started with the 1998-99 school year. And, it was really a survey of teachers and the kind of practices that they use, the kinds of experiences that children have access to in the kindergarten classroom. So there were questions like, how much time is spent on reading, how much time is spent on math, science, etc. Do you have in your classroom dramatic play area, art area, a sensory area? And that study, followed students, and then it was repeated in 2010 and 2011. And so what we see from the 98 school year to the 2010 school year is a drop in areas, those dramatic play areas, art areas, sensory areas in kindergarten classroom. And we see an uptick in the amount of time spent on reading, the amount of time spent on whole group. And so I think that that is really showing what a picture of kindergarten classrooms, how they changed over those years. And that study, by the way, is being repeated now, 23, 24. It stalled a little bit, but we're hoping that we'll be able to get some more information so we can really see at a nationally representative level the shifts that have happened since then. And just another piece of, to add on to that, in my work at New America, we did some focus groups with principals, and to really better understand their perspectives around kindergarten and the early grades. And several mentioned that it was, right around the early 2000s, after when No Child Left Behind was being implemented, that their district leadership was telling them, we need to get rid of the kitchens. We need to get rid of, some of these toys in kindergarten. We just don't have time for that anymore.
That's really such a shift from the kindergarten I remember for myself. But as a parent, parent to parent, I empathize with what you were saying about your daughter's experience and what you saw when you got into her classroom, because when my child started kindergarten, I was hearing other parents saying, okay, how much math, or will they learn, addition, and when will they learn to read? And I'm thinking, oh, I just want them to play and share and maybe learn how to be away from me for a few hours. It seems so big. And do you think that kind of pressure somewhat is coming from parents too, to push earlier academics?
Yeah, I definitely think so, especially places, in places like, big cities, New York City, for instance, where there's this all this pressure to, get your child in the right pre-K and then even, kindergarten so they can go to the right college. And so I think that there is a lot of pressure both on parents and coming from parents. But I think that all parents want what's best for their child. And so when teachers can communicate, if they're using play-based learning approaches, for example, like why they're doing it, what they're doing. And I also think that, worksheets provide easy proof. Like your child was able to get these letters right. They could, write these letters, for example, numbers, whatever it may be. And that's easy proof. But we know from early childhood, from our, pre-K classrooms, for example, like there are lots of ways to document children's learning. And so we can support teachers, kindergarten teachers, in using more pictures, more video, more conversations with parents about the observations that they're seeing students do in the classroom. Like, that's another way of showing progress. And I think that parents will see that and they'll understand, why.
One thing I really appreciate about the book is that you are not arguing against academics. You're arguing against this false choice between rigor and play. So why do you think that people still see those as opposites?
I think some of it comes for, school leaders, traditional K-12 leaders. Some of it is this, the standards push. If we think about the K-12 academic standards, it may not be immediately clear to district leaders and school leaders how teachers could meet, reading standards, for instance, using playful learning strategies. They have Many of them have a mindset, especially if they've never been in elementary classrooms or never been in early childhood classrooms, that play is free play and it's recess. Like, that's where they play, that's it. And when in actuality, we know there's a continuum of play, anywhere from totally student led free play all the way to no play at all. And in between, there is a range of, where teachers might be providing games for very structured but playful learning. In the middle, I really love this place, and I think that's where I see a lot of good, learning happening, is in this idea of guided play, where it can still be child-centered. They're kind of taking the lead with the play, but teachers are really a guide in those instances. They are, curating the kinds of materials that, are aligned with the standards, are meeting, the goals of the curriculum, but they're allowing, children to play in a dramatic play area, for instance, that might be set up as a store. There's some math standards certainly happening there, where teachers can interject, certain vocabulary and questions and encourage students to do certain kinds of activities, but still allowing the children to take the lead there. So I think we need more examples. They need guidance. Principals especially need guidance on the fact that play is rigor. It is the work of learning. And they need to know, like, when they walk into a classroom, like, what they should be looking for when play is the mechanism for teaching and learning.
I think one of the reasons you're so respected in your field is that your work is so strongly driven by data. And let's talk a little bit about the work you did in preparing to write this book. So you did more than 50 classroom observations in addition to other research that you've done. So in those observations, what are the biggest differences you notice between a kindergarten classroom where children are really thriving versus one where they're mostly complying?
I think the biggest areas there, the ownership of learning. Who has Is it the teacher who is primarily directing the learning? To what degree are children involved? Choice. It doesn't have to be children are getting to do what they want to do all the time, but they do have opportunities for choice and autonomy and talk in those classrooms, that they're interacting with each other. The children are interacting with each other. They're interacting with their teachers. The teachers have spent deep time building relationships. Teachers understand their children, and they have deep conversations about what they're learning.
You talked a little bit earlier about the pressure. We talked about pressure from parents, pressure from legislation and state guidelines and things. And I know teachers feel enormous pressure right now from the state standards, assessments, pacing guides, and in addition to the behavior expectations, just so much pressure on teachers.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say to kindergarten teachers who want to get back to this play-based learning? They want to do things differently, but they feel like they don't have permission, or they're just swept along with what their district requires them to do.
I think that's a real fear for a lot of teachers. Many teachers are so fearful of both appearing to have a poorly managed classroom, so and not meeting the expectations of their administrator. I think many of them are also fearful of losing control of the classroom. But talking about those specifically who feel like they don't have permission, they're going to get in trouble for doing this, I think it's important to always be clear about why they are doing what they're doing. So when, and both in their own mind, but for when an administrator walks in and asks, like, what's going on here? Being able to draw a direct line to what the students are doing, what they're playing, how they're playing, and why, and be able to explain what learning expectations are happening. So I've been in some classes where teachers have put up questions at each center for adults. So like if an administrator walks in, like, here's what we're working on, like, here are some questions that you could ask the children about like what they're learning. And it's both like a signal, this is what we're working on with these centers, and here's how you can engage with the students. I think that's the same for parents also, for parents who might be asking those questions about like why they're playing. For teachers who might feel a little bit more comfortable, I'd encourage them to have a conversation with their principal, share some of the research. There's, good stuff from NAYC about developmentally appropriate kindergarten. There's great stuff in my book, but there's a lot of resources out there that can support them and back them up. Maybe even from their state. Some states have, like Nevada, for instance, have put out, policy statements around developmentally appropriate practice in kindergarten and what that looks like. So look around for those resources that could support them in a conversation with their principal, who just may not know. And they're just following what they've known because they've come from a high school teaching experience or a middle school teaching experience or upper elementary. That's one thing we know from a lot of people in principal roles, is that they haven't had a lot of experience with elementary, but especially the earlier grades. And then I just encourage all teachers who haven't done play-based or a lot of playful learning kind of practices before, start small. Start with relationship building. Maybe it's a morning meeting where you're bringing all of your students together and not just reviewing ABCs and numbers, but talking about, something that's happening in the classroom or something that's of interest to the students. Give them that opportunity to talk and practice their oral language skills in that morning meeting. Also, I'd encourage them to really know the standards and their curriculum requirements well, and think about ways to, especially in centers or small group activities, to just incorporate activities that don't require paper, pencil, or device. You don't have to jump into bringing a kitchen and lots of dramatic play items into the classroom. You can start small. It doesn't have to be an either or, and work up to what works for your class, what's working for you. And I will say, like, kindergarten is not easy. That first part of the year, the first few weeks, it has to be about taking time to get to know the students and really teaching them how to be students. And how to practice the routines, how to, for a lot of them, how to share, how to work together. We need time to really teach students how to do those things. And it's through relationships, it's through practice. And a lot of schools don't allow enough time for that, but I encourage kindergarten teachers to be strong and really explain the reasons why that's important.
I love that idea about putting some questions or suggestions on the board for when adults do come in principals, administrators, even parents, to help the adults engage with the children, because that is another way that they can see that learning happening. And what you're talking about too is relationships. And that's something that I've seen as a thread throughout all of your work, is emphasizing that relationship between the adult and the child.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard to do in a classroom of 30 kids. So the smaller class sizes would help with that, of course. But
Yes.
another thing that I think is cultivating that is the movement, exploration, that constant conversation in more ways than one that is happening in a classroom all the time between students and teachers, between other students and each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that constant discovery as being really essential to learning. That's a through line through your work, I think. And those things are not distractions from the learning, because the learning isn't just sitting down with the worksheet. So
Right.
talk a little bit about the science and the research behind why we know that young children learn this way.
Yep. I mean, the science is really clear, and it's across multiple fields: neuroscience, developmental psychology, and in education, what we talk about is the science of learning and development. We know young children's brains, they're in a uniquely sensitive developmental period. And so in these early years, all the way up through age 8, third grade for most children, the brain is forming millions of synaptic connections, more than at any other point in their life. And what drives that wiring is experience and relationships and active, emotionally engaged in experiences, not passively receiving information from their teacher, but doing, touching, moving, all the asking, trying, failing, all these things. And I mean, we know that even for older students, like, experience is important for learning. So I'm not completely saying that older kids can just sit and get to. I mean, we can do a lot to shift education as a whole and make it more engaging for students. But when we're talking about our youngest children and our youngest students, when they're playing, really playing, their whole brain is engaged. They're making decisions, they're regulating emotions, they're using their language, they're testing hypotheses, they're collaborating with peers. Researchers like Adele Diamond, she really spent decades showing us that play, especially complex self-directed play, is a primary driver for executive function development, which are things like working memory, cognitive flexibility, self-control, which are so important, not just in that kindergarten year, but really predictors of long-term success, both academically and in life. Movement, we know that physical movement, especially open-ended movement, activates the brain for learning. So when kids are moving, they're not always distracted from thinking. Most of them aren't. It's their way of thinking. They need to move to think. And then there's also social interaction. So Lev Vygotsky gave us this, the powerful idea of zone of proximal development, and that idea that children learn most powerfully when they're in conversation and they're working just beyond like what they can do alone, with support of more knowledgeable peers or adults, so that teacher as a guide or just learning from peers. And the conversation that they're having, those conversations, we have to remember they're not a break from learning. It is learning, language development, reasoning, thinking, perspective taking. They all happen in that relationship. And what gets lost when we strip play out of kindergarten is that agency for children. Young children are really wired for, we know from science, that exploration and discovery. So the intrinsic curiosity that they have is not something we need to overcome to teach them. We want to harness that and engage them in their curiosity and find ways to build on that to accomplish the standard, the benchmarks, the curriculum that we the expectations that we need them to meet. And we know too many kindergartens today have replaced that harnessing of curiosity with passive seat work. And, you know, when we think about the science of reading, for instance, which is so important, I'm totally on board with the science of reading, but it actually requires the very language-rich, exploratory, conversation-based environment that guided play and other playful learning practices provide. So they're not in opposition, they belong together.
One thing that makes your perspective so unique, I think, is that you have worked at the policy level, but you've also been in the classroom as a teacher, and you're also a parent.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked a little bit about this earlier. You mentioned that so many administrators and principals may come from a high school background or a purely administrative background, and they don't have experience with early childhood. But how do you think that administrators and school leaders and even legislators and people who make laws around education really fundamentally misunderstand kindergarten?
Yeah, this seems simple, but I think that there is this persistent idea that kindergartners are just smaller versions of older students, and they're not. School is a very new experience for most of our kindergartners, even those who had a preschool experience. You know, when they're coming into the kindergarten classroom, it's the school building itself is just a new place, it can be a daunting place. And so when so many leaders think about kindergarten is just pushing down the model that works or mostly works for older students, it's not going to work for our youngest students. And I think that is the case for kindergarten, but also our first and second graders who are still right in that early childhood space. Also, we need to our leaders need to understand that a different model is needed. So that's one thing. I think there's also a misunderstanding of what young children need from their teachers. Kindergarten is not easy. They're not just little kids. Like, the teaching is really hard. Like, helping young students to learn all the practices that they need for school, to learn those routines, like, that's one thing. But then to help them engage in the really meaningful conversations that I've seen in some kindergarten classrooms, and experiments and observations they're making and feedback they're giving to each other, that is hard work. And so when leaders think about hiring for those classrooms, sometimes there's this idea that, oh, they're kindergartners or young kids, we just need someone who can be caring, that can be nurturing. And yes, we need that, but we also need strong teachers who can really help those children bridge their, early childhood experiences before kindergarten and what comes next, later in elementary school.
I've interviewed a lot of authors. We have a lot of books about behavior challenges, challenging behavior. This seems to be a topic that's at the top of a lot of teachers' lists when we're talking about kindergarten. So
Mm-hmm.
you write about classrooms shifting more towards a focus on compliance and behavior management. And some of that comes from just large class sizes, I'm
Yep.
sure. But do you think that some of what we're calling behavior problems or challenging behaviors are actually children just responding to environments that aren't developmentally aligned with how they actually learn?
Yes, absolutely. Definitely. And I think that some children, they are going to thrive regardless. They'll be fine. But for a lot of our children, this idea of not allowing them to move, when they're sitting on, the carpet, the just like self-regulation that many teachers and schools expect of these, like, just turned 5-year-olds, in many places. It's not realistic for them for long periods of time. You've got to build up to that. And so it's really the behavior problems increase because of the inattention to what those children need developmentally, and really a mismatch of expectations. And then I also talk in the book about the, behavior management systems and, how teachers are looking for some way to, encourage, incentivize, children to sit, still. So we see these, red light, green light, or, move your card or whatever. For a lot of kids, it really just has the opposite effect, because they want, they love their teachers, they a lot of them, they want to do the right thing, but it's not possible yet for some of those kids, or they just need it in a different way. So teachers, I've seen, teachers who, when everybody's sitting in whole group, they are not worried about how children are sitting, sometimes where they're sitting, or what they're moving. As long as they can tell, and they know their students, so they know who's engaged and who's not. As long as they can tell that the students are attentive and engaged, they're not worried about those other things. And contrast that with, some classrooms I've been in where the whole group time ends up taking 25, 30 plus minutes, because the teacher's trying to deliver the comprehension or the phonics or whatever they're doing at the time, and stopping every few minutes to, sit this way, to, stop moving around. And yes, like that might be needed if a child is hitting another child, or you've got to correct sometimes, but just this constant correction, it's not good for that student, it's not good for the class. And it really is just giving the other students this, like, they know who the problem students are, which is not what we want. We want the class to be a community, to be see each other as a team and working together towards learning, to meeting the expectations. And then some of the behavior challenges come because of boredom. That some students, particularly those who went to a really high quality pre-K experience, or they had parents that were able to, teach them a lot before they came to school, or a mix of both, they are bored out of their mind a lot of the time. And so they're not being encouraged to think about their ideas or experiment or, discover. And so for some of those kiddos, the behavior comes out because they're bored and they just can't sit there for another minute. And then certainly I'll just plug that having an assistant, a paraprofessional, they're called a lot of different things in different states, but another adult in the classroom is just so helpful, especially at kindergarten, to be able to attend to all students' needs, both learning and developmental.
So if money were no object, legislation were no object, you could have the ideal kindergarten classroom. You could just design this any way that you see fit. What would children experience in this kind of kindergarten classroom?
Well, one thing that I just said is that there would be 2 adults for sure. And I think the best sized kindergarten classrooms that I've seen are, smaller. So we kind of talked about that a little bit earlier, but definitely under 18 would be my ideal, with two full-time adults, a teacher and an assistant, or another adult in the room. They would look more like a pre-K classroom in a lot of ways. It's because when you think about the fact that 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds, they're not even a full year apart, when they start the kindergarten year. And so the classroom they should be spacious, and there should be areas for imaginary and dramatic play, for blocks, for art, for all those different kinds of, for sensory, and teachers using those areas, not just as a way to provide some free play when they need downtime during the day, but in science, in social studies, in reading, in math, they can, use all of those areas for all of those content areas. There would be, I'm not going to say no tablets or no devices, but minimal use. I think there are some activities that, particularly for intervention and differentiation of discrete skills, there are some programs that can get at those for students. And then teachers can certainly use lots of technology, with in their lessons, fully support that. And a full day, I think kindergarten does need to be a full day of learning to be able to get in everything that we want our students to learn. And then I'd add on, opportunities for outdoor learning, bright, not cluttered, but bright, welcoming, inviting classrooms, and a teacher who is in regular contact with families and inviting them in at any opportunity that there is to bring families into the classroom and engage those families in exploring their children's interests and backgrounds and culture, because that's all part of important learning for our students as well.
Sounds pretty terrific.
Just a couple of things,
Yeah, sounds great. Well, Laura, thank you so much for joining us today. Your leadership in this field is incredibly respected, and I think I speak for all of us at Gryphon House that we are honored to publish your important book and to have you here today to talk about it. I know our listeners will walk away from this episode with plenty to think about as they reflect on what kindergarten can and should be.
Thank you so much.
If you'd like to learn more, pick up a copy of Rediscovering Kindergarten, Embracing Play and Joy in Learning by Laura Bornfreund, and explore additional resources on play-based learning, kindergarten readiness, and early childhood education at gryphonhouse.com. Thank you for listening to Early Childhood Chapters, and we'll see you next time.